Looking at the object obtained in relation to this whole sphere, we see that the actual world of culture was summed up in the vanity of self-consciousness, into a being for self whose content is still that confused world of culture, and which is still the single individual notion, not yet the explicitly universal notion. But returned into itself, that notion is pure insight, pure consciousness as pure self or negativity, just as faith is precisely the same as pure thought or positivity. In that self, faith has the moment that makes it complete, but perishing through being thus completed, it is in pure insight that we now see the two moments, as absolute being, which is simply thought or the negative, and as matter, which has positive being. This completeness still lacks that actual world of self-consciousness which belongs to the vain consciousness, the world out of which thought raised itself to itself. What is thus lacking is obtained in utility insofar as pure insight there acquires positive objectivity. Pure insight is thereby an actual consciousness satisfied within itself. This objectivity now constitutes its world. It has become the truth of the entire preceding world, of the ideal as well as of the real world. The first world of spirit is the widespread realm of its self-dispersed existence and of the self-certainty of its individual forms, just as nature disperses its life into infinitely various forms without the genus of those forms having an actual existence. The second world contains the genus and is the realm of intrinsic being or truth over against that certainty. The third world, however, that of the useful, is the truth which is equally the certainty of itself. The realm of the truth of faith lacks the principle of actuality or the certainty of self as this particular individual, but the actuality or the certainty of self as this particular individual lacks intrinsic being. In the object of pure insight, both worlds are united. The useful is the object insofar as self-consciousness penetrates it and has in it the certainty of its individual self, its enjoyment, its being for self. Self-consciousness sees right into the object, and this insight contains the true essence of the object, which is to be something that is penetrated by consciousness, or to be for an other. This insight is thus itself a true knowing, and self-consciousness has equally directly the universal certainty of itself, its pure consciousness, in this relationship, in which, therefore, truth as well as presence and actuality are united. The two worlds are reconciled, and heaven is transplanted to earth below. With paragraph 581, we are now finishing up this very short subsection, the truth of enlightenment, the true thing, you could say, Wahrung of enlightenment. And we're also finishing up that section on the Enlightenment, and that means that we're actually quite close to finishing the entire section on culture in this massive spirit portion of the work. So we're actually at a very important turning point, and we want to do a little bit of retrospective looking back, and that's part of what's going on in this paragraph. Hegel is doing some summarization and some reflection on how we got to where we are. We want to deepen that a bit beyond the actual text here because he's being very summary in it. And I think it's an important point for us to pause and look back over all that we've covered in this pretty large culture section. You notice that before that we had an earlier section on the ethical order, which was a bit shorter and led then into the realm of culture. And then we had all of this stuff going on within the culture section. And then we had this dialectic that we've been playing out now for commentary after commentary, paragraph after paragraph, of the relationship between faith and insight, both of which are forms of, as Hegel's calling it, pure thought, both of which are coming out of the culture and transcending the cultural problematic as Hegel has elaborated it for us, but also remaining attached, you might say, by a kind of umbilical cord to that very world of culture, because that is the world in which faith and pure insight still have to exist. And even if they're going to be preoccupied largely with battling with each other or insight, getting the upper hand during the Enlightenment in its critique of faith, it always remains within these worlds. And we're going to see Hegel talking about three worlds at this point, by the end of this paragraph, worlds of spirit. And this should, make you think back, if you've been following along with the entire work, of other sections where Hegel has talked about multiple worlds interpenetrating each other. For example, the discussion of the inverted world in relation to the non-inverted world, and then there was a third world there as well in the force and the understanding section. So remember something, again, before we get to the text. Hegel tells us at multiple points in this work that as we move from earlier sections to later sections, there is a process of, however we want to translate, Aufhebung, or Aufheben in the verbal form, whether we want to say sublation, which is not a word that really means all that much, or if we want to be a little bit more cumbersome, but a little bit more exact about it, transcendence and reintegration. That's another way of thinking about it. That has been going on. So all of the earlier forms, what's really essential in them, all the earlier shapes of consciousness, all the earlier dialectics, they're being brought into these later sections. So spirit, the one that we're in right now, and getting fairly close to the end. We'll talk about that in just a moment, where we actually are. Spirit is, in some respect, more concrete, more actual, more wirklich, more real than the reason section, which was already quite real, than the self-consciousness section, than the consciousness section. Think of them as being telescoped into each other and transformed in the process by the way in which they are integrated with each other. So this is a really key point. Now, I mentioned that we are close to finished with this spirit section. So what we have ahead of us is the last part of the culture section, which is called Absolute Freedom and Terror. And it's not very long. It's paragraphs 582 to 595. So we're talking about 14 paragraphs altogether. And then we get to the final section of spirit, spirit that is certain of itself, morality. And that itself is not that large of a portion in comparison to what we have traversed so far. We're looking at from paragraph 596 to paragraph 671, and then all the rest of the work, except for the tiny little bit of absolute knowing, is the large religion section that we're going to culminate in. So, we're a good ways through the development of spirit, the development of mind, the development of Geist, what was most concrete. You could actually end the work there and shave off the religion and absolute knowing section, and you wouldn't lose all that much, except for the closure point, perhaps, and the very interesting discussions of religious life in the process. And some commentators have seen that as a good idea. So where are we, and how far have we come? Let's go back to this paragraph 581. He says, looking at the object obtained in relation to this whole sphere. What is the object obtained? We just saw in the previous paragraph that self-consciousness, rational self-consciousness, has attained a self-understanding of itself through the useful, as something that is for itself, in itself, but also for another. It has grasped itself objectively, gegenständlich, that is, as an object. It's not fully integrated yet, but it is grasping what it is in realizing its place within a larger framework, if you want to call it world or culture or society. So Hegel says, looking at this object in relation to the whole sphere, we find the actual world of culture was summed up in the vanity of self-consciousness. What does he mean, summed up there? Well, remember, at the end of the first section of this entire culture portion, we had self-consciousness, rational self-consciousness, practical rational self-consciousness, trying to figure out where it fit in, not only in terms of the rest of the world and social roles, but in terms of moral values. Was it the noble consciousness or was it the base consciousness? Was it split between the two? If it's not the noble consciousness, who is? Where can it find it? There was an alienation, a insanity, a compartmentalization that had taken place at the end of this section. Hegel talks here about vanity, about things not being able to be fulfilled at that point. What we see along the road of the dialectic is a number of places where it appears that, we might have a resolution. We might actually have finished. We might have reached the end. And it never turns out to be such. So this entire discussion about faith, insight, enlightenment came out of the vanity of the worldly aspect of culture, of Bildung, right? So he says that it's a being for self whose content is still that confused world of culture, and which is still, here's a really interesting line, the single individual notion, the single individual Begriff, a person trying to figure out, again, like, what am I? Where do I fit in? What's my role? Am I sort of at the edge of what's important? What's wichtiges, right? What is essential? Or am I at the center? Is my consciousness determinative of what is? But then if it is, why is everything so screwed up? Why don't things add up? Why don't they make full sense? So he goes on and he says it's the single individual notion, not yet the explicitly universal notion. And then Hegel says, returned into itself, that notion, that becomes pure insight. Pure consciousness, as such, negativity. Its counterpart, faith, is the same as pure thought or positivity. So we have, faith is being used in different ways, right? We have thought, we also have being. We just saw that in the previous several paragraphs. But there's some sort of determinate content there. Faith has an object, a transcendent object, that in relation to, it says, I don't matter as much, right? I am consciousness, and yet there's something greater out there beyond that I ought to, in some way, connect myself to. And pure insight says, well, that's very interesting. Let's look at this. Let's examine. Let's analyze. Let's see whether these things really do add up. Faith, what are you up to? And we don't have to go through this whole discussion again because we've just passed through paragraph after paragraph of insight's critique. That is what the Enlightenment is, in part. Now, notice that the Enlightenment itself is dependent to some degree on faith as something it can push against. It can gain some traction. It's not just a critique of culture. It's not just leaving faith behind. It's the interplay between faith and insight that matters here. So he goes on and he says, in that self, faith has the moment that makes it complete, but faith perishes through being thus completed. And we've talked about that. And the Enlightenment historically is a time when, at least for some people, the faith of the past, something that in fact was transcendent, that went beyond, religion that was just based in culture. Think about, traditional Greco-Roman religion. We had a transcendent conception of God and our relationship to God through rituals, through a church, through whatever you want to say. People found that to no longer be sufficient for making sense out of the human relationship to the divine and the understanding, the self-understanding of what the human is or could be. Faith winds up, you might say, evacuating itself in the period of the Enlightenment, coming after the Reformation, in which we have this proliferation of different exciting new viewpoints and counter-responses on the part of the older church. All of that in the Enlightenment becomes seen as vain. So he goes on and he says, this completeness, the completeness that faith had, still lacks that actual world of self-consciousness, which belongs to who? To the vain consciousness. Aha, this is where that stuff that we thought we'd left behind comes back, right? The person of faith, the person of insight, they still live in a world whose basic traits and structures are in fact still described by those earlier dialectics, those earlier shapes of consciousness. That, constant interplay between social classes and the political class, between service on the part of the noble consciousness and appropriation on the part of the base consciousness, between the city and its demands and the household and its demands, and the gods of the household also resisting that. All of that is still, to some degree, in play, and it's still as screwed up and muddled as it had been before, because these still have to exist within that world. So Hegel says, this is a world out of which thought raised itself to itself. It's possible to do that, right? It's possible to transcend that world. What's going to be the case now? Why does Hegel then talk about three worlds? So here's the transition point. He says, what is thus lacking? Lacking to what? Lacking to these two by themselves, faith and pure insight, insofar as they are outside of the world and yet still anchored in the world of culture, insofar as it doesn't fully understand itself and can't iron out its contradictions. What is lacking is obtained in utility, this concept that we've been exploring, and which is going to be important in the next section. Utility, insofar as pure insight there obtains positive objectivity. He goes on and says, pure insight is thereby an actual consciousness satisfied within itself. This objectivity now constitutes its world. A new world is being generated. I almost said created. No, it's being generated. It's being generated out of the other world. Again, think back to the force in the understanding section. The inverted world was generated out of the world that we perceive and that we attempt to produce laws about that have something to do with the forces there, right? Taking into account us, the observer, and we generate another world, which is not, we shouldn't imagine these as sort of like side by side with each other. They interpenetrate each other. The world of utility is the world that we live in, now revealed to us in light of utility. It's a different world, but it's also the same world, just viewed in a different way. That becomes possible, according to Hegel, for pure insight. It wasn't possible for faith. Faith was too preoccupied with its own objects. It wasn't possible for the self-consciousness, the various forms of self-consciousness, including the final one, the one torn against itself, right? It wasn't possible for them to arrive at that point either. It is possible for insight. And insight now, in understanding itself, is proposing to everybody else a vision of the world, a vision not only of the world, but of their place within it. This is something new. This is something revolutionary. So Hegel says, this objectivity now constitutes its world, the world of insight, the world of the Enlightenment. It has become the truth of the entire preceding world, of the ideal as well as of the real world. Notice that Hegel's already talking about two worlds there, and talking about insight and its grasp of utility becoming the truth of both of those worlds. So now Hegel actually tells us about three worlds. First world of spirit, second world of spirit, third world of spirit. How are these connected with each other? Again, think back over the sections that we have traversed. First world of spirit, he says, is the widespread realm of its self-dispersed existence and of the self-certainty of its individual forms, just as nature disperses its life into infinitely various forms without the genus of those forms having an actual existence. What are we talking about there? We're talking about individuality. We're talking about something that Hegel at one point called the spiritual animal kingdom. Everybody's got their thing that they do, their project. None of them actually connect with each other. We can generalize about things, but for the most part, they pursue their course, and there is no sort of overarching, let's call it ideal, that incorporates them, right? We have something similar at the beginning of the self-consciousness section. Hegel says, just like life dispersed itself into all these different kinds of individual lives, and we can say, what did they have in common? Well, they want to eat each other, they want to survive. We can ask at that juncture, what the hell's the point? What's going on here? What really matters? And the answer is, well, to the individual, their thing matters, but there's no larger context, nothing that Hegel would at that point call truth. There is self-certainty. I know if I'm doing that I'm a cobbler, cobbling is my thing, and I need to make some money so I can eat and make some more shoes. And you ask me, well, where do you fit into the society? I don't know. Is there a society? I'll let somebody else figure that out. That somebody else figuring that out, the political class, or the religious class, or whoever, the intellectuals, they're grasping the second world. He says, the second world contains the genus, the Gattung. And I put genus here into the plural because, it should be Gattungen, right? But really, we're talking about multiple genuses, multiple forms of forms, right? We have all these different forms of life, and somebody actually has to sort them out and think the big questions, This is the Plato saying, well, how do people comport themselves? Some people are driven by this, other people are driven by this, other people are driven by this. Maybe those correspond to parts of the soul. We can have all different theories about this sort of thing. That is grasping people and their projects, what motivates them, what leads them into action, into their relations with others, in terms of what he's calling genus here. Don't get too hung up on the biological notion of genus, because that's not what he means. He's talking about some sort of ideal reality and the fact that we can actually work with that. Then Hegel says we go beyond that. The third world, that of the useful, is the truth which is equally the certainty of itself, he says. Then he says, the realm of truth of faith lacks the principle of actuality. The certainty of self is this particular individual. The actuality or the certainty of self is this particular individual lacks intrinsic being in itself, an sich. But in the object of pure insight, he says, both of these worlds are united. And they're brought into this third world. He says the useful is the object insofar as self-consciousness penetrates it and has in it the certainty, not just of the object, but he says of its individual self. its enjoyment, its being for self. Self-consciousness sees right into the object. And that includes not just seeing into other objects, part of a world, or other people, part of a shared world, but also into oneself, and realizing that oneself is an object, not only for oneself, but for others. One is useful, just like all these other people, for somebody. Perhaps for everybody. Perhaps for the world. Right? So he says, this insight is a true knowing. Self-consciousness has equally, directly, a universal certainty of itself. It's pure consciousness in this relationship, in which, therefore, truth as well as presence and actuality are united. Isn't that nice? It looks like we're actually at a resolution point, aren't we? As opposed to culture, earlier culture, where we didn't have a resolution point, where everything was all screwed up. And now notice how Hegel ends this section. The two worlds are reconciled, the ideal and the actual, the world of certainty, the world of truth. And heaven is transplanted to earth below. Heaven, the heaven of faith, the heaven also of insight, is transplanted to this world of utility. Sounds pretty good. How's it going to play itself out? That's what we need to turn to the next section to see. But of course, the title kind of gives it away. Absolute freedom, sounds really good, and terror.